Hello, I'm Matt Firth, one of the developers on the Ear Production Suite. This video is a brief introduction to the software and a quick tutorial to help you get started. The Ear Production Suite is comprised of three components. Firstly, there's the Ear Production Suite VSTs. So these are a collection of VST plugins that you use to define audio assets to include in an ADM file and to author the ADM structure. They also include monitoring plugins to render audio through the ear, otherwise known as the EBU ADM renderer, which is the reference renderer for ADM. Then there's the ADM export source VST, and this is included to support ADM export from projects which are using the Facebook 360 or Visor VST plugin suites, rather than the bespoke Ear Production Suite plugins. It can also be used to include pre-baked audio into an ADM file. And finally, there's the Reaper extension. This is a plugin for Reaper itself that allows you to import ADM files into Reaper and to export from a Reaper project to an ADM file. So in that context, it's essentially the bridge between the Ear Production Suite plugins or the ADM export source plugin and the Reaper software itself. The roles of each of these components will become clearer as we work through these tutorials. So let's look at installation. The Ear Production Suite VSTs and the ADM Export Source VST should be installed to your usual VST3 directory. So on Windows, this is usually in Program Files /Common Files /VST3. On a Mac, this is usually your home directory /library /audio /plugins /VST3. The Reaper extension should be installed in your Reaper plugins directory. And this also includes some VST preset files which should be copied as well. So on Windows, this is usually Program Files /Reaper x64 /plugins. On a Mac, this is usually your home directory /library /application support /Reaper /user plugins. So with the files copied into the appropriate directories, we can verify that they've been installed correctly using Reaper. So let's start Reaper, and first of all go to the File menu. Here you should have a new option, Create Project from ADM File, and this verifies that the extension has been found and loaded correctly. If we click an empty FX slot on a track, it will open the plugins window, and here you should now be able to see several ear plugins and the ADM Export Source plugin. So let's begin with the tutorials. First of all, let's look at the purpose of each of the plugins within the suite. The plugins fall into three categories: input, control, and rendering. There should only be one control plugin in a project. This can be fed by any number of input plugins and feed any number of rendering plugins. The available input plugins are Ear Object and Ear Direct Speakers, which are used for the ADM objects and direct speakers type definitions respectively. The central control plugin is called the Ear Scene. This receives metadata from each one of the input plugins and has audio routed to it on specifically allocated channels from each input plugin. It provides a user interface for authoring the ADM structure and passes this collated metadata onto the rendering plugins. The audio is also routed through to the rendering plugins. There are several audio rendering plugins provided in the Ear Production Suite. Each begins with ear monitoring. The suffix defines the speaker layout that the plugin will render to, according to BS 2051. So first of all, let's explore the ear plugins. On a new track, I'm going to create an instance of the Ear Scene plugin. This will initially be in auto mode, which means any new items, that is, any new input plugins, will automatically be added to the default program. Programs are listed across the top, and they can be named. We can assign a language to a program, and we can add additional programs. We can add items to the program. Currently there's no input plugins in this session, so there are no items available. For further help, you can click the question mark icon in the top corner. Let's look at the input plugins. So on a new track, I'm going to create an instance of ear direct speakers. Within the user interface, we can see the name of this input. This is pulled through from the Reaper track name. We need to specify the layout of this direct speakers input. For this one, I'm going to select 5.1. We also need to tell the ear scene how it is being fed this audio. Because this is a 6-channel source, each of these channel ranges occupies 6 channels. So for example, by selecting 5 to 10, I'm informing the ear scene that the audio for this input will be fed to the ear scene on channels 5 to 10. Also within the UI we have some level meters and an illustration of this speaker layout. If we go into the ear scene, we can now see that this input is available within the item list. Now let's create an instance of ear object. Again, the input name is pulled through from the track name, and we need to specify routing. Because objects are always mono, these channel ranges are always just one channel. So by clicking 1, I'm informing the ear scene that it will receive the audio for this input on channel 1. We can set the gain of this object, its position, and its extent. We also have a 3D position control. And of course, all of these parameters can be controlled by automation. Now let's look at the monitoring plugins. So on a new track, I'm going to create an instance of ear monitoring 0 plus 2 plus 0. And this is a simple stereo renderer. Within this UI, we have some level meters for each of the channels within this speaker layout. A monitoring plugin should be fed the full 64-channel bus of an ear scene. So following on from tutorial 1, we'll now create a project from scratch using the Ear Production Suite plugins. So we'll start with the ear scene. So on this first track, I'll place the ear scene plugin. And when you create an instance of this, it goes into auto mode, which means any new input plugins will automatically be added into the default program. And this makes it very quick for us to build our first program. So we're going to set the track width for this to 64 channels. And it should not send to master, because at this point it's not been rendered to a loudspeaker layout. So let's render this to a loudspeaker layout by using one of the ear monitoring plugins. In this case, I'm going to use 0 plus 2 plus 0 because I want a stereo output. And this needs to be placed on a 64 channel track because it needs to receive all 64 channels from the ear scene. And let's create that routing now. Ensuring that we're sending all 64 channels. Okay, now we can start adding some inputs. I'm going to start with a 5.1 input. And so for that, I want to use the Ear Direct Speakers plugin. I'll select a 5.1 speaker layout. And because this is the first input plugin, I could use the first 6 channels of the ear scene. I need to set this track to 6 channels wide and ensure it's not being sent to master because it needs to go through the ear scene and the ear monitoring plugin first. And now I can set up that send to the scene. So sending all 6 channels to the first 6 channels of the scene. And if we go into the scene, we can see that it's picked up this input. So let's put some media on this track. And now we can test playback.
M plus 30. M minus 30.
And that seems to work. So now let's add an object into the mix. So for this I'll use the ear object plugin. Because the first 6 channels are now used in the scene master, I'll send this to channel 7. Again, it should not be routed to master. You can scroll through or just hit 7 on the keyboard. So let's put some media on that track. And we'll test the playback.
M plus 30.
So at the moment that's coming out centered because we've not adjusted the position. If we move the position control and play back again,
M plus 30.
we can hear that that source has moved to the left hand side. So now let's automate this object movement. I'm going to set up envelopes for azimuth, elevation and distance and set them into write mode. So now as I move the position control during playback, I'll write new automation data into these automation lanes.
M plus 30. M minus 30. M plus 0.
If I take that out of write mode, we can play back that automation.
M plus 30. M minus 30. M plus 0.
And there we have our first audio program. Let's try exporting that. So from the file menu we go to render, and now we have a new option, ADM file, in the format drop down. So it's detected that we're using the ear scene VST for producing ADM metadata. Click render. And that's it, we've written out our first ADM file. So now we'll look at using existing ADM files in a project. There's basically 3 ways you can do this, and we'll go through each of the 3 methods in this tutorial. We can create a new project from an ADM file, we can import an ADM file into an existing project, or we can explode ADM media that has been placed on a track. So now we'll look at the various ways you can get existing ADM media into your projects. So in the first example, we'll go through the file menu, and we have this option to create a project from an ADM file. And this gives us a submenu with various plugin suites. If you don't have these plugin suites installed, these options will be greyed out. So we'll create a new project from an ADM file using ear. We'll use the file that we exported in tutorial 2. And now that's been imported into a new project. As you can see, our 5.1 channel-based source is present, as is our object-based asset along with all the automation data. If we go to the ear scene, we can see that those items are present in the program. On the channel-based asset, we have the ear direct speakers plugin. That's been correctly configured to 5.1 and is routed to channels 1 to 6 of the ear scene. On the object-based asset, we can see that's been routed to channel 7 of the scene. By default, when we do any form of import, we get an ear monitoring 0 plus 2 plus 0 plugin. Now let's look at some of the other methods of getting existing media into a project. So from a new project, I'm going to create a new track, and on that track I'm going to place a media file. In this case, I'm going to use a 5.1 channel asset which already has ADM metadata within it. Because this already includes ADM metadata, when I right click on this, I get the menu option ADM with options to explode using various plugin suites. So in this case we'll use ear. And as we can see, that 5.1 channel asset has been extracted from the original file, and it's placed an ear direct speakers plugin on that track. This is routed to the scene, and again we're given a monitoring plugin. If we open the scene, we can see that that item's been added into the default program. Now let's add another ADM file on top of this. This time we'll go through the Insert menu and select Import ADM file into current project. And this time I'll use a copy of the noise file which already has the ADM metadata within it. As we can see, that object has been placed onto another track with all the automation data and an ear object plugin. Because channels 1 to 6 are already in use by the 5.1 asset, this has been routed to channel 7 of the ear scene. Because the ear scene already existed, this new item doesn't exist in the default program, because the ear scene doesn't know which programs you want to add these new assets into. So we'll select Item, check the box for this new object, and click Add. And now that's been added into this program. In tutorial 4, we'll look at using third-party spatial audio plugins with the help of the ADM export source VST. So this time we'll create a new project using the Facebook 360 plugins. And I'm going to create it from a far more complicated ADM file this time. This ADM file has two audio programs, one in German and one in English. To help illustrate the ADM structure, audio programs become tracks that are VCA masters. Audio contents also become tracks that are VCA masters but slaves of the audio programs. This makes it easy to monitor just a single program within an ADM file. Both of these audio programs share the same main audio content, which is a 9.1 channel based mix. They use different audio contents for dialogue, one in German and one in English. If we look at the track that's being created for the English dialogue, we can see that it has an ADM export source VST on it. This has been set up as a direct speakers input, it's mono, and this includes all channels, or in this case just one channel. On the 9.1 channel input, we also have an ADM export source VST, which has been set to direct speakers, 9.1, which is 4 plus 5 plus 0, and this includes all channels as well. In order to support direct speakers with Facebook 360, each of the legs has been separated out into separate channels, and these are rendered as objects in those speaker locations. So if we play this back,
Und auf der Bühne ist jetzt alles.
we can hear that we're getting both the English and the German program. Let's just solo the English program.
I'm not the better for that.
And now the German program.
Und auf der Bühne ist jetzt alles an Pyro verfeuert.
So this makes it very easy to monitor individual programs within an ADM file. Tracks which represent audio programs are prefixed with APR, and tracks which represent audio contents are prefixed with AC. Because we can't support advanced ADM structures during export when you're using generic spatial audio plugins, the structure essentially becomes flattened and just includes everything within the project. So in this case, if we wanted to just export an English version, we need to switch off the German assets. So if I open the ADM export source VST for the German dialog and unselect including ADM export, now when I go to export through the render dialog and select ADM file, we can see that 2 of 3 instances of the ADM export source VSTs will export because one instance does not have include in render set. And there we go. So this has produced a flattened ADM structure, including just the English program. Let's look at how dynamically moving objects are handled when we're using the Facebook 360 plugin suite. So I'm going to create a new project. And this time I'm going to use the panned noise example, which already includes ADM. And as we can see, the object has been found and extracted from the ADM file, along with automation data. We have a Facebook 360 spatializer on this track and an ADM export source VST. We can see that this has been set to type definition objects. There's no relevant pack format or channel format for that because we'll be writing our own from the automation data. The ordering of these plugins is important because the ADM export source VST essentially acts as a tapping point for the audio, so we need to take that before the spatializer, since this essentially converts it to ambisonics. In fact, if you get these in the wrong order, when you go to render, it will give you a warning that the plugins are in the wrong order. As we saw in the last tutorial, the Reaper extension reads the automation data for the Facebook 360 plugins in order to determine how objects move about a scene and to generate ADM from that automation data. If we're not concerned with using objects and we can just use a common definition for an audio asset, then we can use any plugins we like, and this tutorial will go over that workflow. So from a new project, I'm going to place some audio files onto tracks, so a mono file and a stereo file. And if we play this back, this plays back just as any other Reaper project.
M plus
So we have the mono file coming out of the
M
center
plus 0.
and the stereo
M plus 30.
is panned left and right as you'd expect. So if we want to include these in an ADM file, we simply need to place instances of the ADM export source VST on these tracks. So for the mono one, we'll include it in the ADM export, set the type definition to direct speakers and the pack format to mono. For the stereo file, again, we'll add the ADM export source VST include it in the ADM export, set it to direct speakers, stereo, and all channels. That's because we have both the left and right channels on this track. If they were separated, we'd just select which channel we have on this track in this drop down box. And now that's ready to export. So this is the file we just exported. This is the AXML chunk. We can see we have an audio program with an audio content, and in that audio content we've got two audio objects. The first one was the mono track, which references the common definition for mono direct speakers. It includes one track UID reference. And for the stereo track, that references the common definition pack format for stereo and includes two track UID references. So let's make this a little bit more interesting. Let's do some HOA. So on another track, I'm going to place the noise file. We'll set this to 4 channels so we can do first order ambisonics. And we need to encode that. So I'm going to use IEM's stereo encoder. This is set to SN3D, first order ambisonics. And we'll pan it over to the left so we can tell the difference. We'll define this point as an export source. So include in ADM export, type definition HOA, pack format, first order SN3D. Now obviously we can't monitor this because we can't monitor an ambisonic signal on headphones, so we'll put a binauralizer after that. Now let's listen to that track. Obviously you could automate these parameters so you could have moving objects within the HOA mix. So now let's render that. Now this is a file we just exported. This is the AXML chunk. Similar to before, we have the first two audio objects, which were mono and stereo, and now we've got a third audio object, and this was the noise track. So this references the pack format, the common definition pack format for first order HOA, and it references 4 tracks. So that brings us to the end of our tutorials. I hope you find them useful, and we'd really welcome any feedback on the tools. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your interest in the ear production suite.